Hi everyone, happy Sexy First Friday. I can't believe it's already the first Friday in October, and today we are super excited to be bringing to you the second in our Sexuality Basics series, talking about what the four dimensions of the sexual story are. Oftentimes I don't actually talk about this, but I am also a 4D model certified sex therapist, and today we're going to talk about those components in conjunction with also the Enneagram a little bit, and how different Enneagram types and instincts might show up in different ways when we are looking at that as well within our sexual stories. So I'm just waiting for Sam to hop on, and then we will get started, and hopefully she will be here soon for us to talk a little bit more about oh, here is Sam. Let me accept her joining, and sometimes we do every once in a while, so we always start a little bit early. And let's see here. I did accept her. Go live. Oh, there we go. I think it's working. There we go. Yay. Hi, Sam. I couldn't hear you. Can you try again? I can see you, but I couldn't hear you. I still can't hear you. Can you hear me? Okay. Hmm. Oh, okay. So we lost Sam. Hopefully we can get her back on here just a second. Let's see if we can hear her this time.
Can you hear me
I
now?
can I can hear you now. Yay! We always come on a little bit early because every once in a while we have technological issues. I'm just glad things worked pretty smoothly today because you never know, right? And how things will go with these live. I can't believe it's October already. It feels wild that it's already Sexy First Friday again. I don't know about for you.
Yes, I know it snuck up on us.
Well, today we are
Cross
going to
our
continue.
fingers for the
I
technology.
know. Today we're going to continue our sexuality basic series, and today this is episode 2 of that 3-part series, and today we're going to talk about the 4D model of sexuality, which is a model that talks about how we create our sexual stories and the impact that that has on our sexuality. But I will have Sam start with just our kind of standard introductions, and she'll talk a little bit more about our series, and a little bit about who we are.
Great. So if you're new here, which most people are not, we mostly have repeat viewers here on Sexy Fridays. But if you're new here, I am Dr. Sam E. Greenberg. I'm a sexuality researcher primarily, and I'm also an Enneagram coach specializing in sexuality, intimacy, and relationships.
And I am Lindsay Frazier. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a certified sex therapist and IE accredited professional. I have a private practice out of South Minneapolis where I specialize in relationships and sexuality utilizing the Enneagram. So that's a little bit about us. Do you want to talk a little bit about why we decided to do this series, Sam?
Definitely. Also, if you don't know us together, we're a dynamic researcher therapist duo, and we do a lot of work together, trainings. We do this Instagram Live series, Sexy Fridays, that we come at the sexuality and Enneagram topic from all different angles, from a clinical angle and a scientific angle. And we love working together. We're 9 and 5 partnership. So one of the reasons we decided to do our mini series that we're doing, which is a 3-part series on sexuality basics, is because we want folks to know we actually are more than just the sex and the Enneagram people. We definitely are the Enneagram sexperts, of the Enneagram world. But Lindsay is also a licensed sex therapist, and I spent many years as a sexuality researcher apart from the Enneagram. So we actually have a lot of expertise in just sexuality matters generally. And a little sneak preview, we're also going to be doing some mini series on Enneagram basics and relationship and intimacy basics because we have all kinds of different knowledge we want to share with the world. So today's 4D topic is one of Lindsay's areas of expertise that she doesn't get to talk about so much in our regular Enneagram and sexuality work. Take it away, Lindsay.
Yes. So one of the things I want to start off with is that oftentimes in the sexuality world, or the way that we think about sexuality, what often happens is we focus on the physicality or the body components of what makes sex work. So, am I having orgasm? Am I having pleasure? How's my body functioning? What kind of positions or what kind of sexual activities are we doing? And when we focus a lot on that, what we're forgetting is that there's many more components that actually create our own sexual reality as well as our sexual stories. And so as I was mentioning, as I was waiting for Sam to kind of hop on here, I have this great certification as well that I don't often talk about in this 4-dimensional model that was created by Gina Ogden. And so what I love about Gina's model, and I did some mentorship underneath her, I got to go to Esalen and do all these kind of trainings with her, and it was a really exciting thing to do. And so what happens is in reality, actually, we have 4 components or 4 dimensions that make up our sexual stories. So it's not just the physical, which is one of the stories that we hold, which is the physical body, but we also have our mental stories, our emotional stories, and our spiritual stories. And I think one thing to keep in mind with the spiritual story is the spiritual story isn't those religious messages that we get around sexuality. Actually, those components will be in your mental story. Spiritual story is about a connection to self, other, partner, and if you believe, even through sexual experiences, connection to God or higher power, or those oh God moments, as Gina used to say, that we have that can happen and occur around sexuality. One of the other things that comes with these 4 dimensions, and we're going to go into each one of these dimensions a little bit more in depth and talk about how it shows up with clients, is that you can have light and you can have dark stories around that, or positive or negative. But I like the idea of kind of light and dark because we are all light and dark, right? Nobody is all light, nobody is all dark. And when we think of positive and negative, that kind of puts more like labels or judgments, sort of what's happening. So the light parts of your story are the things that let you get in touch with your sexuality and your sexual being and who you are holistically and embracing that. And when you think of the shadow parts or the dark parts of your story, those are the parts of your stories that might limit you from having access to this really beautiful part of who we are in our sexual being. So that's a little bit about the model. I was telling Sam before we got on here, I realized that Renee's on here. I've actually even done trainings and workshops with Renee around this model. She's a therapist here locally in Minneapolis as well. We have done all-day trainings. I have done weekend workshops. There's a lot that can go into this model, and so I'm not going to go into all aspects of it because there's also a beautiful experiential component that you can do when you're in person that I love, that is walking around a wheel and kind of moving into some of that experiential processing that can happen as well. I hope someday to do workshops and retreats again where I can bring that in. But we're going to give you the basics so you can learn a little bit about sort of what these components of the story are and how they impact us. You have any thoughts or things you want to add before I move into sort of the different quadrants, Sam?
Sure. I'll just say that this isn't an Enneagram focused topic. Like I said, we're doing our sexuality basics series. We can go kind of beyond just the Enneagram and sexuality overlap, but we have kind of a little bit to say about the way each quadrant might relate to Enneagram. And that'll be like a lesser focus of this session today, but we will mention it a little bit. So if you're here for Enneagram reasons, like you don't have to run away.
We will still bring some of it in because we know some of you come here for all that Enneagram and sexpert knowledge. Well, let's just start a little bit, and let's start with the mental quadrant, or the head quadrant as it's called. And what this is your light part of this is going to be the path of discernment and choice. So beliefs and messages about spirituality and sexuality that we kind of look at. So, gosh, sex will be a lot of fun. I can't wait to get into that, right? That would be like a light part of your story, and then the other path of that, or the shadow part of that, would be more the path of judgment, shame, or guilt. So, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm not attractive enough. I don't like how my body looks, I don't know if my partner loves me. Like these types of things can kind of come out in the shadow aspects of the stories that we have. And we are both of these, right, as far as how we present. But when I kind of present that, what are some things that kind of pop into your head around sort of the mental story and how that might impact clients? I know this is newer to you, but you had some great ideas when we were chatting around how that impacts and influences your clients as well. And we had some Enneagram thoughts on that too. So I'll let Sam share that piece.
Yeah, my first sort of is question and thought is that the spirituality, like kind of religious sexuality messages that, like you said, go under this quadrant rather than the spirituality quadrant, that's one of the things that impacts people most mentally, at least in my experience working with people, especially in kind of Western American culture and like highly Christian cultures. There's a lot of like the puritanical messaging that when you first hear this, you might think is spiritual, but luckily Lindsay, steered us straight that spiritual aspect is about you connecting yourself with spirituality versus your spiritual messaging. So I see like the religious and spiritual messaging really trip people up in the mental space around sex. Like they might feel desire physically, be there emotionally, and even wanting to connect with their partner spiritually. But as they move in, like boom, these messages are popping up mentally saying like, that's wrong, or that's against God, or having desire isn't good. And then that can kind of interfere with moving into spontaneous sexuality. I'll pause there before I say anything about Enneagram.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think a lot of people, when they're looking at this model, they do they think that those spiritual messages you got from religion will be in there. And there is a lot of hangups. The next quadrant we're going to go into is about the more physical body. But for instance, like what comes up for me is I have had some clients that have come from really conservative Christian backgrounds and actually were someone that, like, when we talk about Enneagram stuff, were like sexual instinct dominant and like had this like desire and want for like wide sexual exploration, but the mental message, or that shadow part of the mental message, would stop them from actually going into the physical body pleasure sensations and enjoying sex in the ways that they wanted. And this is just one small component too. And just like even as we're going forward, what you're going to see is kind of how the quadrants can play off of each other as well. So I have one message in my physical body that this is really pleasurable and fun and I'm enjoying, like I like how sensations feel, but then my mental part of my brain can come in and kind of stop me from actually having the pleasure from that. Enneagram wise, I think what you said, which I completely agree with, is our head types, and I'll let you touch on that a little bit, but our head types in particular might get a little more stuck in this quadrant and might have a little bit more things that they have to push through to be able to move into more positive, or like, I wouldn't even say positive, more presence during sex. That's a better way to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're sort of newer to the Enneagram, so there's the three centers of intelligence. So we have the head types, the harder feeling types, and then the body or instinct types. And we think there's going to be some alignment with the quadrants here. So the head types are going to be, because I'm a head type myself, I'm on type 5, because we live up in the head so much, and our center of attention and our center of perception is in the head. As we try to move into sexuality, is sort of head-based stories that are going to be the most impactful of the 4 quadrants in terms of maybe impacting the way we move through sexuality. So I'm thinking our 5, 6s, and 7s might be quite familiar with the dimension of the head, the mental.
Knowing we have limited time, like, oh my gosh, we're already like halfway through, like, which always happens when we're doing these sexy first Fridays. I'm going to move on to the next quadrant so we can make sure we kind of talk about each quadrant and have the opportunity. But the next one is actually the physical body. So this is the one that I think most of us sort of associate when we're thinking about sexuality. Like, what's happening in the physical body? Am I reaching orgasm? What kind of positions are we doing? What's the physical body? Again, I'm also kind of talking mental though, right? When I'm going into that even, which I think is interesting as well. They're all going to be correlated, right? Like in how they interact. But the physical body, I mean, it's going to be the path of sensation. So it's the full range of experiences, the smell, the taste, the touch, the sight, and the hearing. It's movement and stillness. It's this really ability to have comfort and safety, as well as arousal and orgasm, like what's happening in the physical body and where we feel pleasure sensations. On the shadow part of that, it can be the path of sexual dysfunction. So if I have sexual pain, if I can't maintain or have an erection the way that I want, if I'm not able to get an orgasm, and all of these kinds of things that can kind of happen, premature or delayed ejaculation, any of these kinds of sexual functioning issues that we might have. I even think of it too, sometimes the shadow, like let's say like you have had maybe an unwanted sexual experience and then certain body sensations, like if somebody grabs the side of my body, right, like I'm like, oh, I don't like that, right, which again, that's the physical sensation that's also triggering maybe an emotional or a body or a spiritual experience sort of within that, because maybe sex wasn't safe. So I think it's really interesting sort of how those components kind of come into play. What comes up for you when you think of that component or that quadrant, Sam?
The thing that comes up for me the most about this quadrant is that this is the quadrant that people over focus on as relates to sexuality and as relates to kind of seeking help or assistance for things that are going on sexually, is that people will present, especially in sex therapy for you, Lindsay, but also sometimes in coaching, and will say like, oh, here's the problem. My problem is I can't have an orgasm. That's the problem. It's a physical problem, or any of those things, other things you mentioned too. And there's, maybe because of enculturation or whatever reasons, we have a hard time understanding that just because a problem is manifesting physically doesn't make it a physical problem. And that's true of everything, not just sexuality. Like often we see people presenting with health concerns, and Western medicine especially will just address it at the physical body level. And there's so much stress and mental health and emotions and spirituality that's all going into it. So I think of this quadrant, and it is very important, and it is where we experience a lot of our sexuality is actually in the body and the physical sensations of our body, but that people over focus on it, especially as relates to kind of issues that they're unhappy with in their sexual lives. Um, and as relates to the Enneagram, we are thinking just the body types, which is our 8, 9, and 1, are going to be a little more hung up here. And also our self-preservation subtype, subtypes of all types will be sort of most hung up here in the physicality arena. We also find that our self-preservation people tend to over focus on the physical aspects of sex. So under focus on maybe the spiritual and emotional, and to a lesser extent the mental, and over focus on the physical. So whatever's happening physically is what's happening. The other stuff doesn't matter as much, but often they're partnering with someone for whom those other quadrants matter a lot more. So I guess that's all I have to say about this one.
I think you bring up a really good point, and like why a model like this is kind of helpful too, right? Because if we have, say, our body types or self-preservation type that's a little bit more focused. Like I think even like with my body types, a lot of times it's like guttural, like intuition, like what's working or what's not working, and sometimes not having the mental or the other capacity to kind of even like voice that, right? And it's like when you have this model, it sort of helps everybody step back. Like if I'm more focused on sort of like one quadrant of this model, or this is where I think mostly sex happens, like having this helps you see more holistically, like actually all of these pieces come into play. And it's interesting, right? Like somebody comes in with, the erectile dysfunction issue in my office, and they think it's all, medical. And then you find out like, oh, like I don't feel emotionally safe, or like I feel criticized a lot. And like all of a sudden you're getting this bigger story of these other components that are actually impacting or influencing, or the mental story, around that in particular for men is like, I should be a sexual machine and I'm not a sexual machine, right? And it's like, and if we don't have like the tools to look at the other aspects of sexuality, we could just be like, oh, I think you need some Viagra. Let me just send you along to the doctor to get that. And sometimes even in those scenarios, the Viagra doesn't work because there's an emotional and a mental and maybe even a disconnection to self that's kind of happening there. So I think it's really interesting sort of how that comes into play too.
I also want to say really quickly the opposite thing, which is that sometimes there is a purely physical and physiological thing happening. Um, An example that springs to mind is kind of like perimenopausal and menopausal and immediate postmenopausal women will often be really kind of upset by the fact that their vaginal lubrication situation has changed. And they're like, have I stopped being interested in sex, I don't feel that way subjectively. I'm the same amount of interested, but my body's not responding the same way. And that is often purely hormonal. So there are cases where there's physical things that are happening that sort of bother a person that are truly physical and in the body. But in my experience, it's like that might be like 15% of the things that people present with. It's really more commonly like all the quadrants at once.
Yeah, and if you are someone that's working with sexuality, like it's always so important. Like I always say, like, let's rule out anything medical happening. And so even when people come into me, like I always will ask the question, like, have you seen a medical doctor to rule out anything that might be happening? Because for men on the other end, like if you have diabetes, if you have like any kind of like heart issues or blood pressure issues or cholesterol, like you can not get the blood flow you need to maintain an erection. But it's like also, but even then, you often have some mental or emotional stories going on around that. So it's just a really interesting thing. But yes, I get lots of perimenopausal and menopausal women in my office who wonder like what's happening to my body. And that's such a hard stage. I'm probably not that far away from that myself as someone in their 40s, to be able to, knowing what those experiences are like as well. Well, just for the sake of time, I'm like, oh my gosh, every time we do these, Sam, I'm like, we could go on forever. We're going to move into the emotional quadrant or the heart quadrant. And really what this is that the light part of this is the path of passion and compassion. And this is like the ability to feel loving, passionate, longing, experiential feelings with a partner. It's also the place of like empathy and connecting at a deeper level. And then you also kind of have the path of fear and anger that can come into play, more of that shadow component of this particular quadrant as well. Disgust, frustration. It's really interesting. It's like, it just made me think of like even like sexual instinct dominance. Like, I'm disgusted by you. I'm passionate about you. That kind of push pull, right? Like you can see a lot of that kind of even just in that going back and forth sort of within that emotional quadrant as well. But when we were thinking about sort of like, I think we were thinking like our head types, and also like interesting enough, like I was just like, oh, social dominants get a little stuck here too. It's all about bonding and connection and that like, working on the relational, emotional components to stay close and connected. But what would you add in this particular quadrant as well?
A lot coming up for me about the emotional quadrant. So, first thing I think of is Enneagram 4s. Like, our Enneagram 4s are the quintessential emotional heart quadrant, where they're often even identifying as demisexual, meaning they have to feel that emotional heart connection and attraction with someone to even feel sexual desire at all. They are just the big, deep, deep feelers of the Enneagram. R2s also are the big, deep feelers of the Enneagram. And threes are denying that they are, but they are also a feeling type. So I for sure think the feeling types fall here and get tripped up here as well. And by tripped up, I mean, if twos and fours, especially, if they're not feeling like the right emotional vibe, the right emotional feelings, feeling seen in the right way for fours, feeling cared for and tended to in the right way for twos, and even social dominance, not feeling cared for and tended to and bonded, then they can kind of lose interest in sex or not want to move into sex. So they really spend a lot of time here. Um, and the other thing that comes up for me, I want to share is kind of an example from clients about the interaction of the physical quadrant and the emotional quadrant. But I'm going to pause that for 1 second and just see if you have any Enneagram thoughts or general thoughts to add first.
Well, actually, I would agree with everything you were saying. So our twos and fours, and they get a little bit more hung up here. And like you're talking about the ability to go to the physical, which is exactly what you're going to touch on. So you go for it, Sam.
Okay, perfect. So, one of the things that I have happening with a client is that we had a physical, physiological issue presenting in the one partner, and that partner knew it was purely physical and physiological. It was actually due to a medication that they had started taking, and the sexual issue presented exactly in time with the medication, so they knew it wasn't anything else going on. But this particular person was partnered with a four who's really living in like the emotional heart quadrant. And the four, even though their partner was saying, this is not about you, it's not about how I feel about you, it's just this medicine. The four is, getting in kind of the dark side of the emotional quadrant, which is that anger and fear, and just being like, it must be about me, don't you want me anymore? What about, we need to talk about, the feelings about this. I just need to make sure that you don't suddenly find me disgusting. And the other partner was like, not at all. Like, that's not what's going on. But because fours are more prone to being in this quadrant, the four is kind of like, well, I might, if I had a sexual issue presenting, it might be because of this dark side of the emotional stuff. So it must be my partner is doing that too. And it actually turned out that the partner went off that medication and switched to a different one, and the problem went away immediately. So that's one of those slightly more rare cases where it was a purely physical quadrant. But even though that was a purely physical quadrant situation, we exist in relationality, with our sexuality a lot of the time. And this emotional quadrant still came into play. So even if you're kind of just in one for, what's going on, your partner might be in a totally different one.
You bring up such a good example, right? Where like there can be a story in the emotional or even the mental, right? Around what that means. And then, we're gonna move into the spiritual, which is about connection and disconnection. How much disconnection that creates sort of in that spiritual quadrant and that ability to connect with your partner and yourself sort of on a deeper level. If I start worrying about whether you're into me or not, then I'm not really connected to myself, nor am I connected to you. And so just an interesting perspective. And right, like this was a purely physical thing happening, but yet we still created a different sexual story around it. And so you can just see the importance of like having all of these quadrants and understanding each piece and component of it. Our last quadrant is the spiritual or the meaning quadrant. And really this is the path of connection and meaning, which is that deep sense of connection with oneself, with the other, to higher power. It's kind of like, I think of it in a lot of ways, like the way that she describes this, or even how I think about like that, just that ability to be present fully with yourself and fully with another. And then it's also the path of disconnection or over control, right? It's hard to have oneness with ourselves or with others if we're trying to control what's happening or not happening right within our lives. And I think like our sexual instinct dominant people can really kind of live right in this particular quadrant quite a bit. And at the same time, someone like me whose sexual instinct repressed might not think it's so important to have the depth of level or be fearful of it, right? And so I think even like when I talk about that for so long in my life, and I'll use myself as an example for this, it was like, that was really scary to have that deeper connection to myself or deeper connection to other. And how many times I maybe missed out on the opportunities to have that more spiritual connection with someone else because my emotional story of that this is scary and overwhelming and I'm kind of afraid of it prevented me from having that connection to myself or to a partner. And so I think it's really interesting how like one instinct can get maybe a little bit too wants to be here all the time, and then and then someone that's sexual instinct repressed might think it's not that important, it's really kind of scary. What would you add on this particular quadrant?
I'm gonna go ahead and use a personal example too. So we just end on personal examples. So I'm a sexual instinct dominant, and this is oftentimes all we care about for sex. So yes, I would say this, and to a slightly lesser extent, the emotional quadrant. And the kind of physical and mental, we can kind of just forget about them. So sexual instinct dominants are really about that. Sex is about psychic merging, like really going beyond the self, connecting with something bigger, dissolving boundaries, and that stuff is really lovely. But I'm going to channel our colleague Frederick here, who would say that we overdo it significantly, and that we can be a little delusional about it being like the only thing that matters. And a lot of other people, especially our self-preservation dominants, they just don't feel that. And like our sexual instinct repressed people, like Lindsay said, they can find it scary, or even just not even scary, but just not really where they want to focus. So I'd say I'm definitely guilty of overdoing this one. And that this is definitely where the sexual instinct dominants like to hang out in of the quadrants.
And the model itself actually has a center as well. So like if this model were laid out, I wish I could have a little example. It's like on a wheel, right? And in the middle, you do have what's called the center, which is the center of integration or the center of disintegration, right? So it's like sort of like if all of these things are in light, like you are going to have this beautiful flow of story. And like she kind of calls it Oz, like the ability to kind of have I don't even know what the right word would be, but I kind of think of it like fully present in my sexual story, my sexual life, so that I can have that like spiritual connection to my higher power or God or self or whatever thing that you may call it. And then if you're not, like how kind of everything around, so either everything is coming together and you're having this beautiful sort of sexual life, or everything is kind of falling itself apart, right? And so kind of had that ability to do both of those, which when you're doing the experiential piece of it is really beautiful. You can kind of see how that plays out. When I'm doing the experiential component of the piece, I actually walk clients around this wheel. So when they're telling me their story, like, well, we're going to stop. So maybe we start in the physical story and then they bring in their mental story. I have them walk to that quadrant and then we start talking from there. What they have figured out with this particular model, they did some neuroscience stuff around it as well. And her latest edition of her book before she passed away actually included some of those neuroscience findings as well. But like when you physically move your body, you're actually integrating that in a physical body somatic way as well. And so it has this beautiful ability. We can process it with our mind, but as well in the actual physical body and moving through the positive or the light and the dark. I always go to positive and negative, but like I don't like those words. And I like how she uses light and dark and shadow, right? Because that's more the reality of what's happening here. And I think ways that it's really helpful sort of in practice with clients or even for yourself is like, I have people draw these stories out. You could draw out your own sexual story. How big would your spiritual story be taking up 75% of your story, and you got little itty bitty parts left for the rest? Or is it balanced? Because ultimately everything in life, just like even when we talk about like our Enneagram type, right, is like that ability to integrate and like really understand that all the quadrants are important, right? Understand our light and shadow parts of who we are to have that higher power and that higher growth and access to our higher selves. It's very similar here as well. And even though it's a sexuality model, you can actually use it for a lot of other aspects of your life. But it's great for like sexual dysfunction. It's great if you have self-esteem issues around sexuality, your sexual identity and expression. How do you communicate issues or concerns? Now you've got, added language on how to do that as well. And just to kind of get you out of stuckness or defensiveness or rigidity kind of in that way as well. Like I said, I have done all day trainings on this, weekend workshops. We could be here all day, but I think it's just a beautiful model that I wanted to introduce to give you another pathway to talk about your sexuality. Anything you want to add, Sam?
No, I think that's perfect. And we're at the end already. So I just actually wanted to remind people that we have released our flagship self-paced course on sexuality and the Enneagram, which is Enneagram and Sexuality for Transformed Relationships. And our very super early bird rate actually just ended on Wednesday, but we have a regular discount rate that's all the way through October. So if you're thinking about learning more from us, it's a 6-hour course, and we have that discount rate through October. And if you're here watching this, just DM us and refer to this episode, and you can get an additional 15% off of that course. So we're hoping folks will join if they're here today, and they can get that extra discount.
Well, I think that's it. As usual, Sexy First Friday went really quickly. I say for me, because clients sometimes say that in therapy. For you, it went quickly. For me, it was a long time. But I think it's been beautiful to see you again, Sam. We're going to come back next month in November to talk about the third part in our series around sexuality basics. And if, like Sam said, like we do kind of have a 3-part series. So we have the sexuality basics, then we're going to be talking about relationship basics, and we're talking about Enneagram basics. And so stay tuned for learning about other things from us where we have expertise beyond the Enneagram. And if you ever have ideas or things that you want to see us do, always reach out as well.
Happy to see you, Lindsay. See you
Great
next
to
month.
see you as well. Bye.
Bye.